Huguenot political theory. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572 had an invigorating effect on Huguenot political thought. As the prospect of execution said to sharpen the mind wonderfully, so the imminent prospect of persecution tended to sharpen the minds of the Huguenots. It's a striking fact, says Allen, that a good many of the pamphlets published in the year that followed August 1572 alleged necessity as a sufficient justification under the circumstances for armed rebellion. Self-preservation, it was argued, is a natural right. Of course, as Allen points out, one could preserve oneself by submission or by voluntary exile just as much, or perhaps even more so, than by armed rebellion. It's only if it is considered that there is no obligation to submit or to go into exile that self-preservation could be said to justify armed rebellion. François Hopman's Franco-Gallia is an attempt to show, by means of historical analysis, that the King of France was and had always been subordinate to the Estates General. Whatever the Franco-Gallia's merits as a piece of political theory, as history, it's a mass of inaccuracies, confusions, and misunderstandings. Somewhat more surprisingly, it seems not to have had any significant effect on contemporary Huguenot political thought. Another anonymous piece, the Réveil Matin, allegedly composed by somebody with the improbable name of Eusèbe Philadelphe Cosmopolite, is remarkable perhaps more for its reticence in the matter of religious references than for its general, if somewhat incoherent, expression of ideas current in the Huguenot community. It's easy to think of the polemical political writings of this period as being all of a piece. And while there, of course, are recurrent themes and indeed striking similarities, there are also significant differences. John Allen remarks that both Hopman's Franco-Gallia and the anonymous Réveil Matin differ essentially from the tracts of the Mémoires de l'État and from the Vindiciae, in that the views expressed or implied in them are strictly political or juristic and are not radically concerned with any religious conceptions. Hopman proposed that the people's transference of the right to rule to a king did not in any way involve a permanent transfer of sovereignty. On the contrary, he thought the people and their representatives have the right to oversee the actions of the king, as well as the right to depose him if necessary. As Calvinists, the Huguenots found themselves dogmatically tied to Calvin's commitment to complete passive obedience to the powers that be, anything less revolutionary than which it is hard to conceive. However, in their particular political circumstances, this policy was radically inoperable. The French Protestants had three options. They could submit, go into exile, which many were later to do, or they could resist. If, despite Calvin's teaching, resistance to political authority was to be a legitimate option for Christians, then it would have to be justified. And typically, such justifications propounded a theory of the original sovereignty of the people, or a thesis that royal governance was not absolute but conditional, or indeed both. In Geneva, Calvin's successor, Theodore Beza, developed a theory of popular sovereignty. He arrived at this conclusion by arguing that since people necessarily preceded their rulers, political power had to have originated with them. Between 1554, when Beza wrote On the Authority of the Magistrates to Punish Heretics, and 1574, when he wrote The Rights of Rulers and Duty of Subjects, the political landscape had changed significantly. Abroad, the Scottish rejection of Queen Mary, begun in 1559, culminated in her abdication in 1567. And at home in France, a civil war had broken out in 1562. After the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, the position of French Calvinists was so perilous that they were finally moved to advocate resistance as religiously justified. According to Beza, magistrates are given to men so that the laws necessary to human flourishing might be maintained. The magistrate, he writes, is he who, by the public consent of the citizens, is declared custodian of that peace and tranquillity. This peace depends on the observation of laws, which establish the safety of all the citizens. But what is a citizen to do if his prince or supreme magistrate, either through cruelty or ignorance, combats the reign of Christ? Beza recommends having recourse to one's local inferior magistrate. When he writes, then several princes abuse their office, whoever still feels it necessary to refuse to use the Christian magistrates offered by God against external violence, whether of the unfaithful or of heretics, I charge, deprives the Church of God of a most useful and necessary defence. Beza teaches that it shall be lawful and permitted to the subordinate magistrates to take precautions for themselves and for those over whom they exercise guardianship, and to offer resistance to the tyrant of the people. But if those magistrates should refuse to perform their duties, then, he says, let each private citizen bestir himself with all his power to defend the lawful constitution of his country, to whom after God he owes his entire existence. Zuck writes that Beza thus had removed Calvin's doctrinal restraint against resistance at a time when pressure was mounting for military action among Calvinists, and consequently, despite his doctrinal conservatism, he exerted notably radical influence upon the religion and politics of his age. This referral to inferior magistrates, or ephors, was one respect in which the Huguenots generally adhered to Calvinist doctrine. For political purposes, the people were taken to be their representatives, the ephors or magistrates or Estates Generales, rather than the common mob, still less the individual members of that mob. Resistance, including in case of extremity, tyrannicide, was not something permitted to the common mob or to its members, but only to duly constituted assemblies. The people as a whole are above the king, but the king is above any single individual, writes Rothbard in his Economic Thought before Adam Smith. He goes on to say, more concretely, since sovereignty rests in the institutions of duly constituted assemblies or magistrates, only these institutions embodying the sovereign power of the people can properly resist the tyranny of the king. All in all, I think it is true to say that Calvinists residing in jurisdictions whose leaders were unsympathetic to their religious convictions tended, understandably, more towards radicalism than those whose cities or cantons were governed by co-religionists. This was certainly true of the Huguenots, although their radicalism was measured. In Scotland, another country where Calvinists found themselves at odds with their rulers, however, matters were taken somewhat further. George Buchanan considered the Calvinist doctrine of the restriction of resistance and tyrannicide to the ephors and rejected it completely. Buchanan was perhaps the first to develop and articulate the theory of individual natural rights and to justify tyrannicide not by assemblies or inferior magistrates, but by individuals. Buchanan's The Right of the Kingdom in Scotland was begun by him in 1567, but only published some 12 years later in 1579. As with many political philosophers before and after him, Buchanan has his account of pre-political man. Taking his inspiration from Stoic sources, he sketches man as a pre-rational animal, outside society, outside religion, solitary, and wandering. Such a man is not only pre-political, but also pre-social. This type of approach to political anthropology is similar to that of Buchanan's contemporary Juan de Mariana, and to the account given by Rousseau in his second discourse. It is to be contrasted with the Aristotelian and Thomist accounts, and also the view of most Huguenots that man might have been pre-political, but not pre-social. Like Othman and his Francogalia, and the author of the anonymous Réveil Matin, and later Johannes Althusius, but unlike most Huguenot writing, Buchanan maintains a steadfast reticence on the topic of religious covenants, addressing himself only to the political covenant. This is significant enough. Even more significant is that in Buchanan's thought, The intermediate authorizers, characteristic of much Calvinistic theorizing, as we saw them, the ephors, lesser magistrates, they simply disappear. Buchanan insists that the whole body of the people must be pictured as coming together to elect someone to deliberate and concern themselves with the affairs of each member of the community. Now, when we consider the Lutheran and Calvinist contributions to political theory, we saw that their thinking was dominated by the traditional understanding of Romans 13. I discussed Buchanan's contribution to the interpretation of Romans 13 in an earlier chapter, but it's worth reminding ourselves of what he had to say. He insists that this passage in St. Paul has no general application and is addressed to the specific time, place, and circumstances of its making. The church Paul addressed was an infant church, composed, as Buchanan remarks, of a promiscuous crowd of plebeians for whom it would have been extremely foolish to attract the attention of those in government. What advice, he asks, should today be given to Christians living under Turkish rule, his time that is, what except the advice Paul gives to the Romans to omit nothing that could help us to conciliate the goodwill of all men by honest practices? His conclusive argument that Paul's advice was circumstantial and not general is that though he, that is, Paul, minutely explains the mutual duties of husbands to their wives and of wives to their husbands, parents to their children and children to parents, of masters to their slaves and slaves to masters, he does not, in describing the duty of a magistrate, address them expressly by name. So why should he not have done this, except that there were neither kings nor other magistrates to whom he could write? If Paul were writing now, Buchanan says, and were there to be a prince who thinks that not only human, but also divine laws ought to be subservient to his capricious lusts, who would have not only his decrees, but even his nods held as laws? Would Paul not declare him unworthy of being reckoned a magistrate, and put all Christians under an interdict to abstain from all familiarity, all conversation, and all communion with him? Kings, then, no less than common men, may be called to answer for their actions. For God commands the wicked to be exterminated, and accepts neither rank nor sex, nor condition, nor even person, since to him kings are not more acceptable than beggars. And Buchanan gives a long and detailed account of kings, princes, and rulers who have in fact been justly punished. Kings exist only to serve a specific function. Since all men in fact are equal, and no one naturally has authority over another, a king can come into being only if given authority by those over whom he is to rule. The people as a whole are and remain superior to the king. He is their agent or delegate. Buchanan argues that there is a mutual compact between king and citizen such that whoever first withdraws from it and acts contrary to it, it forfeits whatever rights belong to him under that compact. A king who destroys orderly government is a tyrant, and as such is a public enemy. And in a war against an enemy, it is not only the people as a whole who have a right to destroy him, but such a right belongs also to individuals. The coronation promise of the Scottish kings show, Buchanan thinks, that a covenantal relationship exists between the Scottish people and their king. The obedience of the people isn't absolute, but conditional upon the king's performing his side of the bargain. Buchanan believes that when the people do select a ruler, they do not transfer their sovereignty to him, but merely delegate their authority to a person who is not sovereign but simply a minister, and hence bound by the laws of the Commonwealth. Buchanan's theory has radical, perhaps even anarchic implications. Skinner notes that, as Suarez was shortly to point out, in The Law and God the Lawgiver, an appallingly anarchic view of political obligation seems to be implied if one concedes that the power of a whole community of individuals assembled together must be derived from men as individuals, for this suggests that the reason for setting up a commonwealth must be to protect individual rights rather than the common good. thus leaving open the alarming possibility that the whole body of the people, and even individual citizens, may be said to have the authority to resist and kill a legitimate ruler in defense of their rights. For Suarez, this conclusion was a reductio ad absurdum. Not so for Buchanan. For him, one of the reasons for insisting on a Stoic rather than an Aristotelian account of man's pre-political condition may well have been the fact that it helped him to legitimate a highly individual and even anarchic view of the right of political resistance. After the 1570s, Protestant political theory crosses a watershed. Up to this point, political resistance was to be justified solely on religious grounds. After this date, however, this exclusively religious justification is abandoned. The result, according to Quentin Skinner, is a fully political theory of revolution, founded on a recognizably modern secularized thesis about the natural rights and original sovereignty of the people. Some elements of pre-1570s thinking remain. For example, there's still a lingering tendency to make the focus of legitimate resistance some intermediate body or other, the ephors, the Estates General or lesser magistrates, rather than individuals. But this tendency too will diminish in time. The first book of Juan de Mariana's tome on the king and the education of the king is the source of his controversial reputation. It's not a little ironic that this work was dedicated to Philip III. Mariana believed early man to be a solitary wanderer without any settled abode. Self-preservation and procreation was his only interest, and such a life as he lived apart from laws and from any source of authority. Such men lived as animals, being in fact very little more than animals. In this account of the earliest man, Mariana echoes Buchanan and anticipates Althusius. What drives men out of this original brutish condition is its inconvenience, exacerbated by the depredations of other men and wild animals. But if the advantages of civilization were absent, so too were its disadvantages. There was no lying, cheating, stealing, or ambition or avarice, and there was no private property. Still, man's needs outstripped the bounties of nature, and his position vis-à-vis other animals was precarious, lacking the natural advantages of many of these animals. These disadvantages acted as a stimulus to human cooperation under the leadership of those best able to promote their welfare. Men are driven into society by fear, by desire, and by need, forced to cooperate for self-protection. According to John William Allen, Mariana was more dispassionate than the author of the Vindicii, more subtle than Buchanan, and had more imagination than either. Perhaps the most original thing in his book is the dim vision of man emerging from the semi-brute state of nature into a consciousness of himself and of right, and so into full humanity. Despite the similarities between the thought of Mariana on the one hand and that of Buchanan and the anonymous author of the Vindicii on the other, Mariana's account of the political order is in no way theocratic. It is perhaps significant, writes Allen, that for him the inner light by which we know right from wrong was vox naturae rather than vox dei. Political authority needs no further justification when it corresponds to general needs and is directed by the will of the community. In thinking thus, he resembled Buchanan, but was far from the thought of the Vindicii, and yet further from that of the Catholic League. Monarchy is the earliest and most obvious form of political rule, but its negative side quickly gave rise to the necessity for law. Such laws were, in the beginning, simple, but became more complex as society developed. Since the people were the ones to give themselves a king to serve their purposes, they were also entitled to remove him, since what they give they can take away. The prince or king is not the owner of his realm, not dominus, but rather a guide, a rector. His status can never be higher than that of an elected official who is paid a salary by the citizens in order to look after their interests. Like his Protestant contemporaries, Mariana is of the view that the popular will is expressed in representative bodies, the estates of the realm. The estates are the formulators of the fundamental law of the land within which the monarch must operate. Moreover, the estates control matters of taxation, succession to the throne, and the religious establishment. The monarch then, according to Mariana, is very far from being legibus solutus, that is to say, not bound by the laws. The people as a whole are sovereign. Sovereignty has its root in a grant of authority by the people, but such sovereignty does not include taxation and legislation. The people as a whole are above the monarch, Rothbard writes. In contrast to other scholastics who placed the ownership of power in the king, he, Mariana, stressed that the people have a right to reclaim their political power whenever the king should abuse it. Mariana is notorious for his justification of tyrannicide. A tyrant for Mariana being any ruler who violates the laws of religion or, and this is interesting for libertarians, imposes taxes without the consent of the people. One of the powers reserved by the people when they appointed a king was the power to regulate taxes. Because the monarch is given the authority he has for a purpose, which is the promotion of the welfare of the people, a monarch whose actions run directly contrary to this purpose may be reprimanded. First comes a warning from the assembly, which, if not heeded, justifies sterner action. When, however, the people, through its assembly, has spoken, writes Dunning, then and not till then may the private individual justly slay the tyrant. If, however, as is likely to be the case, the assembly is not permitted to meet or to act, the private citizen is justified in killing the tyrant at discretion. Mariana is aware of the practical dangers of such a doctrine, but on the other hand, he thinks that if monarchs are aware that tyranny on their part will warrant assassination, this will give them pause. The removal of a tyrant normally requires the assent of an assembly, but where this is not possible or forthcoming, then anyone may act to remove the tyrant. There is then an ultimate right of tyrannicide that can be exercised by anyone. Around this time, the idea of contract as the basis of political order came into prominence, deriving from reflections on Scripture and perhaps most significantly from Roman law. Since all men by nature are equal, if one is to have authority over another, this must be the result of agreement. Significantly, during this period, in both Catholic and in Protestant circles, there is a secularization of the source of political authority. The construction put by Luther and Calvin on the teachings of Scripture in this respect is dropped, and submission to any particular ruler as the representative of God's will ceases to be the presumptive duty of a Christian. Returning to the Huguenots. The Mémoire de l'État de France of Charles IX is a miscellany of various writings published in 1576. Lovers of liberty will be especially interested to note that Étienne de la Boétie's Discours de la Servitude Volontaire, though perhaps written earlier than 1550, when Boétie was still a teenager, appeared in print for the first time in this collection of writings. Although Boétie was not a Huguenot, his discourse gave a measure of support to the idea expressed in some Huguenot tracts that forcible resistance to tyranny could be justified by appeal to natural law and natural rights. The other most significant works contained in this miscellany were Du droit des magistrats sur les sujets and the Dialogue d'Arcon. John Allen believes the Mémoire de l'État to be a much more significant work in Huguenot political theory than the more well-known, indeed notorious, Vindicii, which appeared 3 years later. The writings included in the Memoir of 1576 almost completely anticipate the Vindicii of 1579. To isolate the latter is a mistake and gives a wrong impression. It should be considered along with the writing which it had once expanded and reduced to order. Its superior importance is hardly at all due to any originality, but primarily to the fact that it states the case of the earlier writers more completely and systematically than was done by any one of them. The author of the Du droit, perhaps Theodore de Beza, and the author of the Dialogue d'Arcon, and indeed the author of the Vindicii, accept the traditional tenet that obedience to political authority is required even when, as is the case with the author of the Dialogue d'Arcon, attempts are made to explain or explain away scriptural texts that were used to condemn rebellion in whatever circumstances. Still, only God's sovereignty is and can be absolute. All earthly sovereignty is limited and conditional, and all rulers are subject to divine and to natural law. Any particular political constitution is created and sustained by the will of the people, so much so that even in hereditary monarchies, the king may be elected. But the king is not only an agent of the people, holding his authority from them, he also in some way has his authority from God. These writings may be said to encompass not so much a political as a politico-theological conception of authority in which a number of not very clearly distinguished notions of covenant, compact, and contract between people, ruler, and God intermingle. As far as determining who the people were in their deliberations, these various authors were committed not to some radically democratic conception, but tend rather to think of the people as being represented by existing institutions, whether nobles, estates, or local magistrates. The right to resist one's ruler was vested not in the people as a whole, but in some or other of these representatives. The idea is neither Catholic nor Protestant, nor indeed modern. It is, in fact, medieval. If these representatives fail to act to resist tyranny, then the people en masse have no recourse. But if the magistrates nevertheless fail in their duty, the community has no remedy against them. It may not rise and depose them. This position is, as we have seen, rejected both by the more radical views of the Protestant Buchanan and the Catholic de Mariana, who allowed for individual resistance in cases of necessity. John Allen writes that the authors of the Memoire du Lestat believed that there could be no merely human obligation. Hence, though the people could set up a government and endow it with force, they couldn't give it real authority. They couldn't create an obligation to obey it, for all obligation is to God. So, while a ruler receives his office and power from the people, the obligation to obey the command of the prince is derived not from the people, but from God. In time, however, the theological element of these reflections diminished or disappeared, and the contractual dimension increased in clarity and in importance. The use of such terms as pactum and fides seemed to imply that political sovereignty was established by a deliberate act of will and with the consciousness of the ends to be realized through it. This, whether he exactly meant it or not, is practically what the author of the Vindiciae contributed to the theory by his use of the word pactum. And this, it would seem, is the essence of what is loosely called the contract theory. A significant strand of thought in the Vindiciae, perhaps not very clearly expressed, but nonetheless there, was a defense of the rights of natural communities. This was later to be developed in some detail by Johannes Althusius. Summary. The polemical political writings of this period are not all of a piece. While there are recurrent themes and indeed striking similarities, there are also significant differences. The writings of this period mark the final transition from a medieval to an early modern system of thought. Among the important writers of this period, we find François Opman, Theodore Beza, George Buchanan, Juan de Mariana, and Etienne de la Boétie. We witness in the voluminous literature an uneasy and confused transition from the doctrine of passive obedience to one's rulers to a tentative doctrine of active resistance.